talk a bit about an introduction to climate change adaptation, sort of what are some tips on it, what is some scoping of it, and the various steps for getting there. Those steps are summarized on the right-hand side of the slide in case you want to read ahead. Exploring some adaptation concepts and summarizing some next steps. So last year, the year before, a really long time ago, we had a meeting at the Cal Academy, and we talked about this first box, which was when we were starting the vulnerability assessment process. And now we're moving on to the third box, which is identifying the management options, which is what adaptation is really all about. Another way to think about the adaptation cycle is something like this, because it really is all of the pieces in it. And it involves not just sort of the mechanics of what's going on and what do we do about it, but also how do you build the capacity so that all the tools that we're talking about using, everyone knows how to keep using, and we develop the tools that we actually need as a community to do what it is we're doing, which is whatever information you need to make the decisions you need to make. So this process, the adaptation working group that you're all part of, has been taking on a variety of things, some of which are fortunately already done, which always feels good when you get to say, we have completed that. So the first part is this sort of awareness step. I'm going to talk about an adaptation ladder of engagement that EcoAdapt uses, but it starts with this awareness step, which is really sort of the Houston, we've had a problem step of the piece, but more specifically figuring out what is that problem relevant to. So thinking about what are the actual needs of the working group and the working group committee members and the agencies that are involved, defining the goals and objectives for them, not including climate change, but before you start thinking about climate change, assessing what the targets are going to be. That's that focal species and habitat workshop that we did. And then thinking about the scale. What is the scope of time that you want to be developing a preparation for? The second part is the assessment, which is what we're still kind of in at this point. We've been spending a lot of time assessing what are the ramifications of this problem. So we did, there was a bunch of work done reviewing existing literature, talking to regional experts, many of you included, and then obtaining climate and ecological response projections. Wow, I have no idea what happened to that image. That is fascinating, because on my computer, not plugged into the monitor, it was fine. So the first step we did of this was the vulnerability assessment, which we used this model, which you can't see because it's not there. But fortunately, the equation is there, so you don't need the graphic part, where we assess sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity of the different species and the different habitat types. And that was all part of that vulnerability assessment process. And all of that was used to estimate overall vulnerabilities for the different habitat pieces and for the region. And you can document confidence levels and uncertainties as part of that. So you define vulnerability in order to assess the extent to which species, habitat, or ecosystem processes are susceptible to harm from climate change impacts. You do it because you want to know what things are most vulnerable and why they're vulnerable. In some cases, you actually want to know what things are least vulnerable, because sometimes that helps you create prioritization, or it helps you bank on what are the winners going to be so that we can focus on the things that will still be here. So why assess vulnerability? There are some things it does help you do and some things it does not help you do. It does help you prioritize species and systems for management actions. This pike is actually for a project we're doing farther inland in California. You have no pika in your region. Develop management strategies to address climate change, so things like restoration, which that's a picture of, and finally, efficiently allocate resources. Vulnerability assessments do not make conservation decisions for you. You're not going to get a decision support tool out of a vulnerability assessment that says, you have this vulnerability, therefore you should do X. It is not a magazine or online quiz. The second piece that we've added to this assessment process is doing the scenario planning exercise. And the way this process works is that you identify key drivers. Here's sort of the array that we've run through over the past couple meetings. You develop headlines, and the goal of the headline is to come up with the essence of how the scenarios differ so that people can get sort of a gut feeling of what do those mean. And then you create short stories to define, and you create narratives, not analytical equations that express some of the key expectations for different scenarios to translate what will be meaningful to people as they make decisions. So scenario planning defined is that it refers to an approach that employs creating storylines of several alternate possible future conditions for flexible long-term planning. Because one of the important things in dealing with climate change is that we're going to need to figure out how to be flexible and adaptive. So it'll help you figure out what vulnerabilities might mean for the species, habitats, and locations we've been talking about, and what vulnerabilities might look like. So what might those manifest into? Again, with scenarios, there are things they can and cannot do. They can help translate what science might mean. They can help you consider a range of future possibilities. They can explore the implications of climate change for individuals, so it becomes a more personal understanding of what that information means. And they can help you evaluate the results of action versus inaction. They do not tell you which future scenario is going to come to pass, and they don't help you determine what the best decision would be. Okay, step 3. This is what we're about to jump into. And that's applying all those assessment results into adaptation planning. So using that equation I had again from the vulnerability section, we want to come up with things that help us reduce sensitivity, reduce exposure, and enhance the adaptive capacity of whatever level of the system you're thinking about. And there's just some random examples. I'll talk more about step 3 later, but I want to give you a sense of where we are on the continuum of what this all means. The next step is implementation. So we're going to create a really great plan, but as we're creating that great plan, I want each and every one of you to be thinking about, what will I do with this plan? Because just as Xeroxing is not the same as reading, one of my favorite axioms in graduate school, developing a plan is not the same as letting it sit on the shelf. So keep that in mind. You actually are going to have to do something with this. So as you're thinking through what are good adaptation strategies, it's really good to start from the place, what are the things that I already have control of as a manager? Identify those, and also identify what are the places I don't have control, but I know we need to do that, and use this as an opportunity to push toward that. But this step should be front and center in your mind while creating the strategies. Okay. Step 5 is integration, which is some of those things I was talking about before, where there are things you don't have control of. So how do we start thinking more cross-jurisdictionally, which this group is actually fantastic because we have a lot of the cross-jurisdictional players from the region all here. So we can think about what are the strategies that can be done beyond just the sanctuary or just the park service or just the county. What are the ones that can work across that, and maybe even thinking more inland? What are the goals that go across regions or intersect with regions, or where are there goals that are kind of at loggerheads, where like someone's trying to create their strategy, which will be not beneficial for someone else's strategy. So how do you find those places and come up with what is a good solution for better long-term outcomes? And then cross-habitat. And that's kind of a hard thing, because a lot of the ways that we do our management, we fund our management, we think about things are really within these compartments. And thinking about the interactions between all those can be a little tricky. Step 6, evaluation and adjustment. I hate to always go back to that South Bay Salt Pond example, but it is such a good regional example of where they've really thought about how do you evaluate how things are working and respond in terms of that. But what you need to come up with, as you're thinking of these management strategies and these adaptation strategies, is start identifying the indicators and the metrics of desired outcomes. Fortunately, you have a couple of tools that have been designed to guide and aid in this that are regional. So one is the Ocean Climate Indicators document, which hopefully as members of this working group, you have all seen or looked at. If not, please go and visit the workshop support page. And there's also another one that was created by EcoAdapt with the monitoring enterprise, the MPA monitoring enterprise for California, and it has some specific regional guidance on indicators. So you want to have those in your adaptation plan so you can identify when something's working and when it isn't. Because, as we just explored in picking these scenarios, if things do not happen exactly as you think they're going to happen, it's good to have a backup strategy to try and put in place to get the outcome you want. Step 7 is sharing this information. A lot of this is internal NOAA communications within the National Marine Sanctuaries, getting them to share information about what they're trying with other branches of NOAA. Wild, crazy, I know. External communications, a lot of regional communication. Clearly, you all are part of that regional communication. Topical with other marine and coastal management entities. There are tools like open channels that talk about marine conservation and marine management that are great ways of sharing information like that. And then with other adaptation entities, and there are tools like CAKE for doing that. So all of this adds up to what we at EcoAdapt call the adaptation ladder of engagement. We stole it from the world of online engagement to get people to do social media. Something I don't believe in strongly, but I did like their ladder, so I borrowed that. So you sort of want to go up the ladder, and right now we're sort of still here in step 2, which may seem hopeless and low, and like we'll never make it up there, but we will.
Thanks, Lara.
Sorry. So the awareness step, fortunately, you guys are in a tremendous region for this. Like, not only are the people in this room all aware of what the challenge is, but you actually have local and state interest and mandate to do it that you can add to the federal mandate, which makes it easier. However, you probably will need to continue to do some community engagement to get people to think about short versus long-term trade-offs. The vulnerability assessment is completed. The scenarios are underway. The next step of this process, which I'll be talking more about in a minute. The implementation phase is probably going to be led by agencies in this case, but you're clearly going to need to have supportive communities. Integration is going to be building bridges between all of those agencies and regions across interests and across geographies. The evaluation we're going to need to design as part of our implementation plan, and it's going to need to be conducted by the agencies, researchers, and communities that are invested in it. And again, this is a great way to sort of recapitulate that awareness and importance piece when you can get communities involved in the actual monitoring. This has been really effective, for example, in the Florida Keys where I used to work, when they got the community involved in bleaching monitoring. Suddenly it became a community challenge, and they needed to work together to even agreeably change some things about the way the sanctuary was run and allow for more protection in some cases. And then sharing, we need to start thinking about what are the mechanisms we can create within the region and beyond. So I know now you're asking, please tell me more about step 3. What's next? So again, I'm going to depress you. I start with the depressing picture. This was like a cover of a magazine like 5 years ago. And it was the headline above it was like, climate change, what it means for you. I was like, wow.
Wow.
So this is where you end up with once you've completed the vulnerability assessments and the scenario planning, is that everything looks like this to you. I mean, like Sam kind of had to pull teeth to get you guys to come up with what's the positive thing that's going to happen. Because this is what you start seeing. Because the loss of things that's really more traumatic, I think, for especially the management community than the what do I get to manage instead? So adaptation options can be sort of thought of in 3 different categories. Resistance is keeping things the same as they ever were. Resilience is having the ability, I believe the official way you're supposed to talk about this is like a willow, bending and returning. But those are floating houses in the Netherlands.
You have to use kelp in our
situation. Yeah, you're like a kelp in the waves. And then response is that you can just pick up stakes and move on. There's an advice column about this on CAKE if you want to read more about the 3 little pigs. The other day, it occurred to me that actually rock lyrics covered these better than anything else. So you've got the Jimmy Cliff, you can get it if you really want. You've got the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. And then you've got the classic covered by everyone, you get your kicks on Route 66. Because you can translate it all into rock lyrics, Douglas Adams would say, don't panic. And because I'm from Seattle, I'm going to talk about something none of you have heard about called rain.
Yeah.
So I like to think about climate change planning and adaptation all in terms of this question. Should I take my umbrella? Because where I live, I actually wake up in the morning and have to think about this. This is not a problem any of you face, but you could think of it in terms of, do I need a better sunblock today? Although now with like your permanent fog going on in the Bay Area, like you got nothing. You just wake up, walk outside, same outfit every day.
It changes throughout the day. You have to carry
It does
everything.
go from cold to hot, Lara.
Okay, cold to
In
hot.
one day.
Cold,
Yeah.
cold would be like
35
60,
degrees.
60.
and hot would be
75.
like, okay, yeah, I might have to take off my sweater. So, but at some degree, everyone makes decisions every day about when you leave your house, what do you need to take with you? And those decisions are based on a number of things. They're not just based on what does the weather prediction say it is. And you get your weather prediction from a number of things. You probably get it from some sort of news resource or online weather thing, or the thing on my phone that tells me miraculously what the weather is every second. Or you look out your window, or you even more boldly walk out your front door and feel what the air feels like. And from that, you sort of make an assessment. What will I be comfortable wearing? You also put into that, what do I need to do today? Like, what you wear if you have to go to a fancy meeting is not what you wear if you're going to go play soccer. It's not what you wear if you're going to go scuba diving. Like, the stuff you have to take to make your day happen changes based on the context you're putting it in. And then also, what is the goal of that context? There's the part of, wow, if I went to meet with the governor, I'd probably be more comfortable in shorts and a t-shirt, but that's probably not what you're supposed to wear when you go meet with the governor. So there's kind of goal, context, and conditions. And all of that determines what you do, and that's exactly what we need to think about when we think about planning for the future. So what are the goals that we have? What is the context, or what is the range of tools and needs that we have to meet those goals? And then what will the actual physical conditions be like to make that determination? We don't just ever make decisions based on that, and as a result, we are not as a society going to make decisions based on what will the climate be in 2100. Because it will be all sorts of things between now and 2100, and we'll need to do all sorts of different things. And part of it will be what I was talking about earlier, Jack, on the we don't know what humans will do. We don't know how many humans there will be in 2100. We don't know what the needs of people will be. We don't know what the needs of the community here will be. So we need to have all those pieces as part of how we think about it. Okay, so what our goals are going to be for the whole next phase of this project are to think about how do we reduce vulnerability and plan for the various scenarios that we lay out. So in vulnerability, again, we want to reduce exposure, decrease sensitivity, and increase adaptive capacity. And I'll talk a bit more about ways we can do that in a moment. Based on the scenarios, you want to think about what potential range of conditions should I be preparing for. So what changes are the most common? What changes would be the hardest to prepare for? What would affect our goals and our context? And what changes would require that we act sooner than later? And we can think about how we build all of that into a plan. So there are temporal components and human capacity components. So a couple years ago, a group of folks that I work with came up with the 5 tenets of climate savviness. I usually like to say savitude. The first is to protect adequate and appropriate space for a changing world. One of the nice things about working in the marine world is that there are fewer things in your way in protecting that spatial piece. So you want to think about how you incorporate things like refugia, places that are going to change less or have more adaptive capacity. You want to look at gradients, be they mostly latitudinal in the case of oceans, less elevational, although since we have cliffs in our scenario, higher cliffs that are less likely to erode are good. So you want to think about how are things going to be moving in response to climate change and how do we build that in. The nice thing about this project is that we've selected a pretty big chunk of the California coast to work within. And maybe one of the things that will happen from this is we'll even say, wow, that's not a big enough chunk. We need to work with the next group of managers that are up farther. Mostly north is probably where you're going to want to be thinking about working, especially if you're thinking about a T&E species that's moving. But there are some things that you'll also want to be thinking about folks that are more southern and how what they're doing may be impacting you. You want to try and maximize heterogeneity, again, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know what new surprises in system responses are going to turn up. If you have heterogeneity in the system, and I'm not just talking about genetic heterogeneity, you have more eggs in your basket, and you aren't sort of betting on this is exactly what I think will do well. You're saying, here's an array of things that might do well. Wouldn't it be great if one of these pans out for us? But gene flow and connectivity are generally thought of as important. And you want to do inclusion of other changes that are happening across, again, that suite of areas that I talked about before, from watershed to landscape to seascape. So how are all those things playing together? All of these parameters basically fall on this idea of planning spatially but thinking temporally, because we're really good at when we start thinking spatially, drawing on maps, but we need to recognize that those maps are going to change over time. And I'm not just talking about plate tectonic heat change over time, but you guys all know that. Okay, so the second one is to reduce non-climate stresses. This is my favorite because I love thinking about interactions. And almost everything that we're talking about on those lists have all these interactive effects, where climate change affects the other stressors that are already affecting this system. And we need to rethink how are we creating those protections so that they'll be more effective with climate change. So one of my favorite things in the whole world is pollution, not because I like it, but I think it's interesting. But pollution interacts with almost all the things that were on those lists from the scenario planning or from the vulnerability assessment. So at lower DO, most things do less well if they're also exposed to a contaminant. pH, as things become more acidic, a lot of contaminants become more toxic, more available, or the species become more sensitive to them. Temperature changes toxicity. It's very exciting. Just like the whole range of things that climate change is changing affects toxicity. And unfortunately, most of the regulatory mechanisms that we have in place right now that deal with especially water quality don't take into account those changes. And so what we have now currently created as our safe baseline or our safe levels for regulation are probably not safe anymore. See, it's another happy story, Sarah. Invasive species and pests is an interesting area because in addition to the movement of truly invasive and pest species, we also have range shifts of species moving into areas where they have not historically been. So we have to sort of rethink that, but we also have to probably rethink what are the ways that we've been doing control, and will those be undermined by climate change? Agriculture and habitat fragmentation affect even the coastal region, as you all clearly know. And then there's issues having to do with unsustainable harvest. There's actually about to be some really interesting stuff coming out of NOAA that kind of implies that our whole understanding of fisheries management is now really challenged because what we knew about how we did fisheries management isn't true anymore because there is no standard steady state. Isn't that exciting? So the bottom line there on the hopefulness, though, is that we already know a lot of ways to address these non-climate stressors, and we can do a lot of work in this area to make these things less climate sensitive. Okay, the third one. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the things that's tricky there is that, you know, as a funder, I find people are saying, "Oh, you have money for climate change? Well, let me repackage the thing I've been doing forever and say it's good for climate change." Yeah. Then, you know, maybe it is, but maybe it's not really that relevant. So I think there's there's a temptation to be like, okay, let's keep doing what we know how to do.
I call that adaptation washing.
Right.
No, to do this well, it totally requires you essentially doing a vulnerability assessment of what it is you think is happening. Because you need to know how is the nature of the stress changing, as well as how is the effectiveness of my response changing. And you have to do that explicitly. There are some cases where it turns out, yeah, actually what you're doing is perfectly the right thing to do. And they found some of that in the way they did forest management in the Olympic Peninsula, for example. The Forest Service and the Park Service did a whole assessment of are our management techniques the right ones? And the answer was yes, in fact, they are the right ones. But at other times, no, you're just like, there's a restoration project that I frequently talk about in the Chesapeake Bay where they started replacing bay grass with the species that was at the southern end of its range that went north from the Chesapeake. Well, what they should have been doing is they should have been starting to put in the bay grass species that was pretty not dominant in the Chesapeake, but lived farther south and was almost certainly the species that was moving in. So you have to make that explicit thing as part of the evaluation. The adaptation washing is a terrible problem, and it's really worse for this than anything else because everyone wants to do exactly that. They want to say, oh, I've always been doing adaptation. It's perfect. Like, people love to say, I'm creating marine protected areas. That's adaptation. To which you say, wow, the Great Barrier Reef was a really big marine protected area and it bleached. Don't think they got the protection simply from being a marine protected area. So the second one is managing for uncertainty, which is one of the tools that scenario planning is actually really great for helping us think through. So here are 3 scenarios for New York City. This one on behalf of BMW, a car company that doesn't like to meet CAFE standards, so I think that one's pretty funny. None of those things are probably what New York City is going to look like in any of our lifetimes. But they do let you think about what are the implications of drought in New York City, of flooding, and of big winter storms. And all three of these things have happened in the past 3 years in the greater New York area. They've had to deal with them all. And coming up with plans for each of those has actually helped them figure out how do we make a more resilient city with resilient systems to prepare for that. And so this is kind of how you should think about that scenario planning exercise. All of these will come to pass, perhaps not at this degree, and you need to come up with plans that work for all of them. The fourth one is reducing local and regional climate change. Yes, there are things you can do to reduce the ramifications of climate change on a local basis. There are crazy ones like shade cloth that they use in the Great Barrier Reef over coral reefs. You probably won't be putting a giant shade cloth over the entire Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, but you might want to think about it. You probably won't be reintroducing beaver, but this is what they're doing in a lot of the Intermountain West. They make mountain sponges, and they're becoming a really good way to deal with interannual rain variability. They diminish lowland flooding, and they maintain water for use over the season when they've had areas that have shifted from snow to rain profiles. Lots of ideas around riparian protection, because riparian vegetation can create microclimate that not only keeps the air temperatures cooler, but it can keep the water temperatures cooler, even without shading. And you could plant a rainforest, and that would help you guys a lot. And the last one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which actually should be part of a good adaptation plan, because there are adaptation options have substantial limits, and there are things that we aren't going to be able to change based on adapting our way out of them. And you'll see that I have oceans on the end of there because of things like ocean acidification. I mean, the only way to reduce that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so there's not so much atmospheric input of CO2. The positive piece of the ocean acidification story is that we've almost come to the point of being able to saturate the ocean so it can't take up any more than it is every year. So all of those are some tools to get you thinking about this. One of the things as we go into this process, I know I've told you I wanted you to have implementation at the top of your minds, but I also want you to take stock in my favorite Amory Lovins quote, which is, "There is no box." And this is like the most exciting thing about climate change in my mind. I am like a total over-the-top optimist. I'll just put that out there for everybody. But one of the things I like about climate change is it allows us to take a lot of the preconceived ideas we used to have about how systems worked that we're suddenly discovering aren't true. Like when I was an undergrad and I took oceanography, did you know the ocean has a huge buffering capacity and its pH doesn't change? Apparently not true. So there are things like that like we take as like dogma forever. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I guess that isn't true. And I want you, as you're thinking about adaptation strategies, to kind of free yourself from what are the things that you believe are impossible, either because of human behavior or because what everyone says is what the system does. I don't want you to ignore science. I still believe firmly in science, but I do want you to free yourself from that's the way it has to be done because it's always been done that way, and think more broadly than that, because I think that's really important. Sometimes climate change, this is particularly true on the social side of implications of climate change, it gives us a get-out-of-jail-free card. Because people made decisions, and it became sort of the management strategy or the policy way we went, that were never really very good for everyone, but they sort of just became ingrained in the system. And suddenly climate change, when it like blows one of those apart, allows you a place to like have the community save face and not have to say, wow, we always really made a bad decision. It suddenly allows you to go, yeah, that's not going to work for us anymore. Okay, let's get rid of that and move on. And I found this has been really powerful in things like environmental justice because it like lets you start from scratch, but it's also really powerful in a lot of places where there's been management conflict over resources. So places like the Florida Keys, for example, it worked really well there. And there's going to be a funny thing on this slide, too. Oh, no, it's just on my screen, not on your screen. Okay, so this is the process as we stand. I've now given you a few tools that you're going to get to apply, some today, but more going forward. And you can see how far along we've gotten. So we're somewhere out, we're right there, actually, at the fourth workshop. We have to finalize the scenario still, and we have at least 4 people who volunteered for that, which is great. And then we're going to work on creating those adaptation plans in the next workshops, I'm thinking. And then after that, all you guys have to do is create a robust region, coastal region that employs climate-informed management, and you're good forever. So we'll get to here, and then you guys will do that. And I think we're pretty good.